In the vast and ancient land of Canaan, where the desert winds meet the fertile slopes of the fields, the city of Shechem was in a moment of relative tranquility. The inhabitants lived their lives in a delicate balance, with the days being marked by cycles of work, celebrations and rituals that gave rhythm to existence. On the horizon, the mountains seemed to guard the city like silent sentinels, witnesses of all the joys and sorrows that unfolded there. However, as the sun began to set, casting a golden light that seemed to melt into the stone walls of the houses, a dark foreshadowing hung in the air. The sky, tinged with fiery colors of orange and red, reflected the turmoil that was about to consume the city. It was as if the firmament itself was in mourning for the impending tragedy. Dinah, the daughter of Jacob and Leah, was a young woman of remarkable beauty and innocence. Her eyes, shining with youthful curiosity in the hope of a promising life, were the light that illuminated the lives of her parents and siblings. With a free spirit and a willingness to explore the world around her, Dinah saw the land of Canaan as a vast field of adventure and discovery. On a seemingly ordinary day, Dinah decided to visit the city of Shechem, in search of new friendships and experiences. She headed to the city with the enthusiasm of someone who believes in the best of people and the world. The city, with its vibrant streets and markets full of color and sound, seemed like a place of promising joy and communion. The beginning of the nightmare. Dinah's encounter with Shechem was a turning point that would transform her life and that of her family forever. Shechem, the prince of the city, was a man of great influence and power, but he was also marked by an inordinate desire. When his eyes met Dinah's, what began as an unrequited attraction quickly became a disturbing obsession. Shechem, driven by a possessive and selfish passion, raped the young Dinah in a cruel and inhumane way. The act that was supposed to be an expression of affection was transformed into a heinous crime, tearing not only Dinah's dignity but also the trust of her family. The horror and trauma she experienced spread like a black stain over the young woman's life and the structure of Jacob's family. The shock and indignation of the brothers. When Jacob heard of the tragedy, his heart was broken. He was consumed by grief and fear, struggling to find a balance between protecting his family and dealing with the repercussions of the violent act. His silence and hesitation reflect the gravity of the situation, as he desperately tried to avoid a confrontation that could further exacerbate the crisis. Dinah's brothers, Simeon and Levi, were deeply indignant. For them, the violence committed against their sister was not only a crime against her, but a direct offense to the pride and honor of the family. The pain and anger they felt turned into an unrelenting rage. The injustice done to Dinah inflamed their hearts, bringing them to a breaking point where the only possible response seemed to be revenge. Given the seriousness of the act committed by Shechem, an attempt at remediation emerged. Shechem, moved by a belated repentance and the need to repair the damage, proposed a compromise. He offered the circumcision of all the men of Shechem as a sign of penance, an attempt to reverse the offense and to seek acceptance from Jacob and his family. This agreement, apparently generous and a sign of goodwill, was accepted by Jacob, who hoped that this measure could pacify the situation. The men of Shechem, sincerely believing in the sincerity of the proposal, submitted to the painful ritual, believing that it would enable them to achieve reconciliation and peace. For Simeon and Levi, the agreement was seen not as an opportunity for peace, but as a chance to carry out a meticulously devised plan of revenge. Under the pretext of accepting Shechem's offer, they were actually setting a deadly trap. They knew that circumcision would leave the men of the city weak and unable to defend themselves. The third day after the procedure was the crux of the brothers' plan. It was the time when pain and weakness were most acute, when Shechem's men were most vulnerable. Simeon and Levi knew it was the perfect time to attack, and they prepared to execute their plan with calculated precision and ruthless brutality. A night of terror. As night approached, the silence of the city was interrupted by an ominous omen. The attack began in the early hours of the morning, when the city was shrouded in darkness and apparent calm. Simeon and Levi, armed and determined, rushed upon the men of Shechem with unbridled fury. The massacre was relentless and devastating. The city, which had been a symbol of hope and communion, became a battlefield. The sound of screams of terror and blades cutting flesh echoed through the streets, as violence spread rapidly. The feeling of despair and the struggle for survival were around every corner, turning the tranquility of the city into a hellish nightmare. When the massacre finally ceased, Shechem was in ruins. The fire spread through houses and fields, consuming everything that was left of the city. The flames that devoured the buildings were like a reflection of the anger that had unleashed the destruction. What had been a center of life and activity was now a landscape of ash and rubble. The flames not only destroyed the city physically, but also symbolized the consummation of the brothers' revenge. The fire seemed to cleanse the city of what the brothers saw as an unforgivable offense, while also serving as a dire warning to others who might challenge the honor of Jacob and his family. Jacob's reaction. Jacob, upon receiving the news of the massacre, was overcome by mixed emotions. While there was a part of him that felt a dark pride in the justice done, there was also a deep sadness and shame for the brutal method his children had employed. The news of the massacre not only shook the father, but also created a stigma on the family, which was now viewed with a mixture of fear and distrust by neighboring peoples. The repercussion of the attack was immediate and significant. The image of Jacob and his sons was tarnished by brutality, and fear spread among the surrounding tribes. Peace, which should have been restored by the agreement, was replaced by growing tension and widespread aversion. The massacre of Shechem reverberated throughout the region of Canaan, causing a wave of shock and fear. News of the destruction and carnage spread rapidly, creating an atmosphere of unrest among neighboring peoples. The surrounding tribes and cities, which might once have considered the possibility of alliance or trade with Jacob's sons, came to view the family with a new lens of distrust and fear. The brutal act of Simeon and Levi not only shook the city of Shechem but also cast a shadow over the reputation of Jacob and his sons. The narrative of ruthless revenge and calculated massacre created an image of cruelty that spread as quickly as the news spread. Security that once might have been secured by alliances and agreements was now in jeopardy, and the reputation of Jacob's family was tarnished by an act of violence that many considered disproportionate. Jacob, as he contemplated the devastation caused by the acts of his sons, felt an overwhelming weight of guilt and regret. The man who had sought to avoid conflict now found himself in the midst of a calamity that far exceeded his expectations of peaceful resolution. The pain of seeing his family sink into a sea of destruction and despair reflected the complexity of his own choices and their consequences. Jacob's silence in the face of tragedy was imbued with deep introspection. He knew that his decisions and confidence in the promises made to Shechem had led to a situation he could never have foreseen in his darkest premonitions. The weight of guilt was palpable, and the shame of knowing that her children had acted with such cold, calculated brutality was a difficult burden to carry. For the survivors and relatives of those killed in Shechem, the loss was inconsolable. The city, which had been a symbol of community and coexistence, was now in ruins. The remaining inhabitants were in mourning, trying to cope with the devastation and trauma left by the attacks. The families who lost loved ones were immersed in deep grief, and the future of the city was in doubt. Mourning for loss and desolation in the face of destruction have become a symbol of the impact of unbridled vengeance. The city that had been a center of life and culture was now marked by sadness and devastation, and reconstruction seemed a Herculean task in the face of the magnitude of the massacre. The massacre of Shechem, in addition to being an act of revenge, became a symbol of the corrosive power of violence and justice done with one's own hands. The story of Simeon and Levi's attack served as a powerful reminder of the dangers inherent in seeking retaliation on your own. Violence, while it may bring a temporary sense of justice, often leaves a legacy of fear, hatred, and mistrust. The narrative of this massacre became a feared tale among the surrounding tribes and towns. The memory of the attack would perpetuate itself as a warning to all those seeking revenge, a warning that such actions could lead to disastrous and lasting consequences. The transformation of Jacob's image. The image of Jacob and his family was irrevocably altered after the events in Shechem. Jacob's perception of a wise and righteous patriarch was tarnished by the brutality of his son's actions. The respect and trust he had cultivated among neighboring peoples was replaced by a fearful aversion. The events in Shechem have become an indelible mark on Jacob's family history, influencing not only his relationships with other tribes but also the internal dynamics of his own household. The brothers' violent retaliation brought with it a new reality of mistrust and tension, shaping how the family would be viewed and treated in future generations. The story of the Shechem massacre has become an essential account in the traditions and teachings of the tribes of Canaan and beyond. She offered complex lessons about morality, justice, and the cost of revenge. The account, with its combination of passion, violence, and despair, served as a study in the limits of personal justice and the consequences of being carried away by rage and the desire for retaliation. On a deeper level, the Shechem massacre is a story about the fragility of peace and the ease with which it can be broken. It's a grim reminder that actions motivated by a desire for revenge can lead to a spiral of violence and destruction that goes beyond original intentions. Reflection on these events has become an important part of the historical and moral narrative, offering a critical perspective on the nature of justice and violence.